to all of the people who've kind of dialed in for this session. Maybe a quick round of introduction from my side. I'm Farooq. I'm based out of Singapore. I'm the CEO of a company called DLT Ledgers, which is basically a company using enterprise blockchain in the space of cross-border trade and supply chain. I've been working for 30 odd years, have done various roles, both as a banker and now from a technology perspective, have worked in multiple geographies, have done a bunch of both global and regional roles. So that's a little bit about me. Let me, I guess, introduce the topic for today's session. And really what I'm going to be covering in the session today is mostly around the context of what's happening with global supply chains. How is digitization impacting a supply chain in general, and what does it mean in terms of digital supply chain? And finally, when you think about the context of the supply chain, how are companies looking at digital transformation to enable digital supply chains to happen? So really, I'll talk about global supply chain, I'll talk about the digitization of the supply chain, and finally, I'll talk about the journey of transformation which companies are undertaking in this area. So let's start with the first topic, which is really about what's happening in the world of global trade and supply chain. Now, it's a big topic, and what I'm going to try and do is cover some of the big secular themes in it. So any trend can be looked at either as a cyclical trend or a structural trend. I'm going to focus my conversation on what I call structural changes in global supply chain. And in a layman's work, global supply chain is nothing but the whole world of cross-border trade and what's happening to the way sourcing, etc., happens and how fulfillment happens globally. So in the context of supply chain trends, there are really 3 or 4 what I would call underpinning themes, which are very topical in today's world. The first is that we are increasingly seeing supply chains shifting and contracting. So that's the first theme I'm going to touch upon. The second theme, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, is this whole concept of resilience of supply chain, which has come about post the pandemic, etc. So resilience as a theme. The third, in the context of climate change and COP26, etc., how are supply chains getting interfaced in the world of sustainability and ESG? So that's the third theme I'll talk about. And the fourth is obviously the whole piece around digitization of the supply chain. So let's talk about these 4 topics around the first piece being this theme around shifting and contracting of supply chains. So if you look at post-World War II, with the advent of the WTO, with the inclusion of China coming into WTO, what you saw was what I would call the globalization of supply chain, which is people looking to manufacture stuff cheapest and in the most optimum manner, people looking at economies of scale, and you saw a huge proliferation of manufacturing activity shifting out from developed markets in the West into some of the markets in Asia, specifically in places like China, which became a huge factory of the world. Now, as that happened, and increasingly as that became the norm, what we saw was a series of geopolitical and economic trends happening, which has forced these supply chains to now start shifting. For example, supply chains are starting to shift, say, out of China into places like Vietnam or into Southeast Asia or South Asia. So that is one of the trends that you see in terms of the fact that supply chain have started to shift. Also, supply chains have started to contract. And I think the contraction is happening as a result of people trying to simplify the supply chain, people looking to drive certain cost and efficiency benefits, because as these supply chains have grown, it's become pretty complex and difficult to manage. So people are really looking to contract it, and people are looking to shift it into newer markets, maybe because of a bunch of reasons to do with onshoring, local shoring, near sourcing. Some of it is a result of what I would call protectionism coming in. Some of it is a function of newer technologies like 3D printing, for example, but that's a big shift that you see. So that old world order where China, for example, was the factory of the world is increasingly getting threatened because of these advent of the newer version of the trade wars, as well as newer technologies coming in. So that's the first theme, that supply chains are shifting and contracting. The second theme is about supply chain safety or resilience of supply chain. So you've got to match this off that in the old world, it was all about optimization of supply chain. Optimization of supply chain really meant that people were looking at economies of scale, people were looking at cost efficiencies, people were looking at ways and means in which they can make this whole concept of just-in-time happen. But I think that whole just-in-time philosophy has increasingly been replaced by just-in-case. So safety of supply chain has become paramount now because of a number of reasons. Some of it is to do with COVID, where we saw supply chain breaking down. Some of it is to do with supply chain shocks that we see, for example, disruption in the chip sector, where you've got a scarcity of certain raw materials. Some of it is to do with physical supply chain issues, for example, the Suez Canal issue. So increasingly, people in the context of supply chain are talking about the safety of the supply chain, because if you can't make the goods available for sale at the point of time that is needed, then the whole piece around demand fulfillment becomes an issue. So that's the second big theme that we increasingly see today, which is supply chain resilience and supply chain safety. The third piece in the context of global supply chain is the piece to do with what I would say ESG, which, as you know, is environment, social, and governance related factors. Now, ESG itself is a huge topic, and there are many reasons why ESG is coming into the lexicon of supply chain. So some of it is being driven by the broader issues around climate change. Some of this is coming as a result of the sustainable development goals of the UNDP. For example, things like responsible production, things like climate action, which is increasingly meaning that the way people produce, the way they source, the quality of their inspection of the supply chain is becoming increasingly an issue as far as the final consumer is concerned. So when you think about any of these concepts of sustainable supply chain, responsible sourcing or responsible supply chain, provenance, tracking, visibility, all of these actually intersect from a perspective of the fact that people are increasingly not just concerned about how quickly something can be manufactured and at what cost, but they're increasingly concerned with the qualitative aspects of that supply chain in terms of a number of factors, from the impact on our carbon footprint, to the way the goods have been produced, to the way resources have been consumed, and the way labor, including women and child labor, might have been used. So it's a pretty big topic in itself. So increasingly, companies who are now in the space of supply chain are also now doubling down on this whole piece of ESG. So those are the three kind of big trends happening in supply chain. And the final one is obviously the theme of digitization. So to recap, what I just spoke about was that in the old world order, you had a traditional view where goods were manufactured in the East, a lot of it was sold in the West. Now that type of supply chain is increasingly shifting and contracting. The second theme, which I really spoke about, was that safety of supply chain is becoming very paramount. Some of it, as I mentioned, is endemic and pandemic related. The third theme that I mentioned about was the ESG theme, or the sustainability theme. And finally, the next theme is really digitization, that supply chains are getting digitized. So that's really the first piece around trying to give you all a flavor of what are some of the macro trends. And I'm now going to double click on this topic of digitization of supply chain. What does it mean? How does it play out, et cetera, et cetera. So when you think about digitization, I think there are 3-4 pieces that we will talk about as a trend. So if you go back to the first industrial revolution of the 18th century, which was the advent of the steam engine and how coal and hydropower came in, and the first wave of the industrial revolution started. In the 19th century, you saw the whole advent of electricity and what that meant in terms of more mass scale production, etc., coming in. We then went through that the third industrial revolution of the 20th century, which was a bunch of stuff getting automated and the whole machination, etc., coming in. So if you reflect back to the time of Henry Ford and his T car, which was the first T model Ford, which was the first example of a mass-produced automobile, to the whole increasing automation which has happened. We are now in the midst of what we would call the fourth revolution, which is really what you call a revolution led by information technology, led by intelligent technology, which is causing the next wave of revolution to come, more otherwise known as Industry 4.0, and it's the precursor to the next wave which will come in the years to come, which is what we call Industry 5.0, which means that the way machines and human beings will interact is going to become more intimate, more integrated, and much more immersive than what we have today. So when you therefore talk about the concept of digitization, this is the fourth instance of that industrial revolution that we spoke about. The second thing is that when you think about digitization and reflect on what are the drivers of digitization, it can broadly be looked at in 2 buckets. At a more tactical level, you digitize because you're either trying to save cost, you're trying to improve efficiency, you're trying to get in more visibility, you're trying to manage your risks better, you're trying to comply with regulations and country rules, etc. a lot better. You're looking to comply with health and safety norms. So a lot of those drivers for digitization of a supply chain are rooted in what I would call these tactical elements, and which is what you will see most companies doing it in some form and fashion. But increasingly, the drivers of digitization are also morphing towards more strategic reasons why supply chains are getting digitized. And those have to do with the usage of data, how data can be used to create new business models, how supply chain can be made into a digital asset, and how people will look at the impact of the convergence of technology in their business, helping them to come up with the next wave of whatever the business model is. So what you find, therefore, when people go down this digitization journey, many of them are focused on the more tactical benefits. But as that journey becomes deeper and broader, it then starts morphing towards more strategic reasons why companies are looking to digitize. And when we again talk about the digitization of a supply chain, it is not just restricted into the physical supply chain, but it's actually all encompassing, from the planning element, the forecasting element, the physical piece itself, the logistics piece, the fulfillment piece, and the more strategic piece around what some of the strategies around supply chain are. So it's actually quite broad in terms of what the scopes are. Clearly, what's the reason why you are seeing that digitization come about is because you had a number of new technologies which have now started to mature and have increasingly come into much more wider use cases. So you think about cloud, you think about IoT, you think about robotics, you think about blockchain, you think about 5G and mobility, you think about big data and AI. A lot of these technologies which are now coming in are what you call intelligent technologies, are now allowing people to get a lot more benefits in terms of driving this end-to-end digitization. And as some of these technologies mature, as they become cheaper, it really means that the adoption becomes far easier. So one of the other kind of drivers to digitization is the advent of all of these technologies, which beyond the hype have now actually started to get more main market, and as well as get much more deeper into the kinds of use cases that can be resolved using these technologies. And so if you take a step back and you think about what a digital supply chain will mean, or what does it actually do, there's certain attributes of a digital supply chain. So one is that with using all of these technologies, it must ensure that the supply chain becomes agile, it becomes flexible, it becomes scalable. And these are just buzzwords to talk about the fact that technology should enable you to respond to problems in the operational aspect faster. Technology should enable you to scale up faster based on where the demand is or where the sourcing is coming from. And technology should allow you to flex the way the supply chain is set up based on what the current kind of needs are. So that's one theme: scalability, flexibility, agility. The second theme is about connectivity. So connectivity really means that you think about supply chain, it's basically a bunch of stakeholders who come together in the supply chain. And that's where technology helps to create that kind of connectivity, which is much more digitally intimate, which is more real time, which is on time, and which kind of uses newer technology like blockchain, for example, to drive that connectivity. The third theme in a digital supply chain is that of trust. And when you think about supply chain and you think about the fact that you've got many enterprises who are sitting and interacting with each other, one of the problems that you're trying to solve for is trust. Trust is really de facto in terms of ensuring that whatever is happening, you can take some degree of authentication, you can take some degree of comfort that it's not fraudulent. And again, many technologies like blockchain, for example, in the enterprise space are being used to actually solve for both the trust issue as well as the friction issue which exists within supply chain or within enterprises. The next piece, which I think is quite relevant in digital supply chain, is a strand, what I would call information supply chain, which is information supply chain is really the byproduct of a physical supply chain, which is all the data and information that you can synthesize on the back of the physical flows. And as companies pivot their businesses into data and data insights, the data that is carried along with that physical supply chain, what I call the information supply chain, becomes really critical, because that's where the next generation of business and business models will evolve. So the byproduct of a digital supply chain is what I call this information supply chain, which allows you to build data-led businesses and allows you to think about using data in a much more insightful and meaningful fashion. Then there are obviously a couple of other facets to a digital supply chain, which is basically the role of internet and cloud, because today, as technology evolves and the interaction between these various counterparties evolves, a lot of it is going to be web-based, will be based on looking at cloud as a technology to help underpin some of these interaction. And finally, a lot of this should lead to what I would call real-time availability of information, real-time visibility of flows, real-time understanding of where things are either in the physical space or in the information space, or for that matter, on the financial supply chain side. So these are broadly some of the attributes of what I would call a digital supply chain. And as I mentioned, a lot of the underlying technologies can enable it. And again, it's a function of where companies look at their problem statements and how do they start the journey. So that's the second part that I wanted to touch upon, which is really give you all a flavor around when we talk about a digital supply chain, or when we talk about a digitization of supply chain. Really, there are 5 things that I mentioned. Yeah, I spoke about the context, which is we are in the midst of the 4th version of an industrial revolution, which is being led by a lot of these intelligent technologies. I mentioned to you that the drivers for this can be very tactical or short term, which is cost and efficiency related, or it can be more long term and strategic, which is to do with data and digital asset creation for the future. I mentioned to you that the scope of the concept of a digital supply chain is not restricted to only a single aspect of a supply chain. It's all encompassing from a perspective of planning and forecasting right down to fulfillment and the actual logistics and of the supply chain. I spoke a little bit about the fact that you have a lot of enabling technologies, which is allowing some of this to actually come to life. And as some of these technologies become more mature, as more use cases come up, you are increasingly going to see a lot more adoption coming up. And finally, I spoke to you about some of the attributes that you would typically expect in a digital supply chain. So I mentioned about trust, I spoke about connectivity, I spoke about scalability, agility, flexibility, information supply chain. So hopefully that should give you some color in terms of what a digital supply chain will look like. So now if I just kind of pause here, I've mentioned in the first instance about the global supply chain trends. I've spoken now a little bit about some of the digital supply chain trends. I want to now touch on the topic of digital transformation. And I want to touch on how do companies go about this whole journey of actual transformation from a digital perspective. And what are some of the lessons, at least from where I sit, I've seen companies look at. Now, when we talk about this whole digital transformation as a journey, the first question which companies have to ask is, where do I start? And this is where what one has to assess is, to what extent are companies digitally mature, and to what extent have they embraced digital into their strategy. And what you'll find is you'll have companies who probably have a plan on a piece of paper, but nothing been executed, right down to the other end of the spectrum, where you will have companies who actually integrated digital into everything they do. So the first point of assessment for companies is going to be around trying to understand and appreciate what is the start point. So that's really the first thing that they will try to understand. The second thing to understand is that digitization in itself is only a small subset of a broader strategy. So when companies are embarking on digital transformation, it needs to be rooted into what I would call the broader strategic imperative. It needs to be rooted in terms of what's happening in the market, what's happening with their customers or consumers, what's happening with regulation, what's happening with convergence of technology in their business, and what's really happening in terms of disrupting their own business model. So a lot of that start of the digital transformation will actually begin from understanding this outside in concept, which is really what is happening outside and what is disrupting, or what are the disruptive forces outside, and how do we internalize that and bring it into a more cohesive plan for transformation. So that's kind of the second dimension, which is really your digital strategy of transformation needs to be built by an outside in view. The other thing that I will touch upon, where many companies get it wrong, is that this is not a digital transformation, is not a refreshed IT strategy. Many people, I think, get mistakenly under the impression that it's about just buying a new technology and trying to put it in the back end of a company. Whereas more progressive companies are really trying to understand how that technology will fundamentally change their whole front to back experience, both at the customer level, from a client experience level, from a client service perspective, from a fulfillment perspective, right down the company. So when we talk about digital transformation, it actually should be impacting all aspects of the company. It's not necessarily restricted to looking at only the back end of the technology. And many companies actually get it wrong here. I would argue actually that a digital transformation, for it to succeed, what's actually more compelling is that there needs to be a cultural transformation within the company, because you can have all the fancy technology, but without trying to change the culture of the company, the way the technology will get integrated into the business will actually not happen. So when you think about cultural transformation, is really about the kind of people you need to hire, the skill sets that you need to hire, what are the measures of success that you will put out in terms of how it will be viewed, what is the, not just the profile of people, but how do you define new roles and responsibilities? How do you change the organization structure completely to be able to flex for that new technology? So a lot of the successful transformation is not just the execution of a technology. It's actually all these surround, or what I would call the softer aspects of change management, which are really critical to make that happen. And many companies you will read about who have failed in that transformation journey have not failed because the technology was not sound. It's just that either the leadership or the people were not able to embrace the changes that had to be made within the company to make that fundamental shift from what they're doing today to pivoting towards what they need to do for the future. And I think that's where a lot of lessons are learned in terms of focusing on what I call the people aspect of transformation to drive digital transformation. And so that's kind of what I wanted to say. And I just want to add a couple of things which is dear to my heart in the context of talking about transformation. And having 30 odd years of work X, one of the things that I've learned is that you can't drive transformation within an enterprise without internalizing the transformation into yourself. What I mean by that is you need to bring in a strong element of internal disruption to ensure that you are fit for purpose, so to speak, or fit for future in terms of being able to actually help your enterprise or your firm transform. So the question I would ask myself as an individual, and certainly something for you all to also reflect upon, is how are you going about in your own disruption journey? Whether it's about disrupting the company you keep, whether it's about disrupting the activities that you do, whether it's disrupting your routine, whether it's disrupting your mindset. I think those are necessary ingredients, especially from a leadership perspective, for you to kind of make the transformation come alive. So to recap over the last 20 odd minutes, what I've really spoken about is give you a bit of flavor of how the old world order in terms of how supply chain were constructed are now changing. I mentioned that they're changing because of a number of factors, including technology, including some of the supply chain shocks we've seen. I spoke about some of the key trends that we are seeing in supply chain, specifically around resilience of supply chain, around digitization of supply chain, about the ESG element of supply chain. And then I double clicked on what does digitization of a supply chain really mean. And there I touched a little bit about both the tactical and the strategic reasons which are underpinning it, as well as the fact there's a lot of new technologies which are coming in, which is allowing that digital transformation to happen. And then finally, I touched a little bit about what the journey of digital transformation for a corporate will look like. How do they start it? The fact that it should not be looked at only as a glorified IT strategy. It's a much more all-encompassing thing. And actually, digital transformation is another real word for cultural transformation of the company or the enterprise itself. And cultural transformation means at the end of the day, you also need to bring it back to yourself in terms of what are you doing to kind of disrupt yourself, so you are equipping yourself for the future. So that's, I hope, given you a flavor of some of the themes that I wanted to talk about during the session today.